All right, y'all, let's just hit the ground running. What I did in my last video was spend about 40 minutes providing you with some basic information, some basic background about the Bible and its Old and New Testaments, background leading up to the first few questions on my midterm exam for Old Testament class. Let's get to those questions and let's try to keep this video short as we can. Question number 1 for my midterm exam for Old Testament. What language is the Old Testament written in, and what books are the languages found? So I think it's good for everybody to know what languages is the Old Testament written in. Now, a lot of people would say, what do you mean language is? It's one language, it's Hebrew. But actually, it's not quite so simple. First of all, you can find different stages of Hebrew in the Old Testament. So we can speak of it as Hebrew, but it's different stages in the evolution of that language. But we can find another language in the Old Testament as well, the language of Aramaic, which some of you may not have heard about. Aramaic, a lot of scholars say, first appeared in the ancient Middle East around the 11th century BCE, so a little over 3,000 years ago. It's still spoken by some people in the Middle East today. It's not a very big language anymore. For a while, it was a pretty big language in the ancient Middle East. It seems to have been Jesus's native language, for example. It's still spoken, I think, pretty much just by small groups of Christians in the Middle East today. What books do you find these languages in? So Hebrew is found in every book of the Old Testament. Aramaic is found mostly in the books of Ezra and Daniel, but you could find a little bit in other books as well, including Genesis, right? Now, by the way, if you hear names like Ezra and Daniel and you're curious about them, you can go look them up. Daniel's actually pretty important for the New Testament. Okay. Let's move on. Oh, let me add really quickly. What about the New Testament? The New Testament is written almost entirely in Greek, but there's also a few words of Aramaic in it. Again, coming from Jesus. Sometimes the Gospels will include a few words in Aramaic attributed to Jesus. For the most part, the New Testament translates Jesus's words or traditions of what Jesus's words were from Aramaic into Greek. But there's a few occasions where it just leaves in the Aramaic, right? And then it'll tell you Jesus said, and it gives you the Aramaic, and then it translates it into Greek for you. It's kind of interesting. Get a little bit of a window into the Aramaic world. So Old Testament's Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic. The New Testament is mostly Greek with just a smattering of Aramaic. All right. Question number 2, what books comprise the Torah or Pentateuch? According to Jewish and Christian tradition, who wrote these books, what is the root meaning of the word Torah in Hebrew? What common translation of Torah in English is contested by many scholars? Okay, this is a bit of a complex question. Number of sub-questions here. What books comprise the Torah or Pentateuch? Pentateuch is a Greek term meaning 5 scrolls, right? It's a term sometimes used for these books. They're also sometimes called the books of Moses for a reason we'll get to in a moment. What books are we talking about? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And really quickly, just to go through these, what they mean in English, and there's different terms used for them in the Jewish tradition. Genesis, the beginning. The book of Genesis isn't just the beginning. It isn't just a creation, but that's what it starts with. Exodus is leaving slavery in Egypt. Okay. I think that book, I always kind of say this as a joke, but I kind of sort of mean it. I wish the book of Exodus were called Exodus/Sinai, because the Exodus, the leaving Egypt, is the first part of the book, but the second part is arriving at Mount Sinai, getting those mitzvot, those commandments from the Mosaic Sinaitic covenant, building the tabernacle, this portable tent that's the predecessor to the temple. But anyhow, it's not just the Exodus from Egypt. It's also going to Mount Sinai and the launching of this Mosaic Sinaitic covenant with all those mitzvot that are a part of that. All right, so we got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, which basically means things pertaining to the Levites. The priests are drawn from the tribe of Levi. in the Old Testament. And it's not only in the book of Leviticus. You get this stuff too in, for example, Exodus and Numbers and some stuff in Deuteronomy. But Leviticus contains a lot of guidelines for the priests, a lot of them dealing with sacrifice of animals, offering of grains, but other things as well, right? So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, the fourth book here. Numbers, and our term for it in English comes from a couple of different censuses of ancient Israel that are taken in the book. And Deuteronomy means something like repetition of the law or second law in Greek, and it's Moses reviewing. It's mostly Moses reviewing the mitzvot, the commandments of the Mosaic covenant before he dies. All right, so that's it. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are the first books of the Old Testament, right? They're sometimes called the Pentateuch. They are often called the Torah, according to Jewish and Christian tradition. Who wrote them? Moses. You could also say God, right? There are some traditions in Judaism that Moses didn't write these books at all. God wrote them. That maybe, God composed them before Moses was born. Maybe in some sense they're timeless at any rate. But the traditional idea is that Moses either somehow writes them down through divine inspiration or receives them from God, right? And Moses, does he appear in all of these books? No. He's not in the book of Genesis, but he shows up early on in the book of Exodus, and then he's there until the very end of Deuteronomy when he dies. Hugely important figure in the Old Testament. Hugely important figure. Really important figure for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Abraham as well, and a number of these other figures show up in all three traditions. All right. So then I go on to ask about the root meaning of the word Torah. I'll just mention here briefly that the word Torah is used in different ways by Jews. So sometimes it's used for just the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Sometimes it's used for like all of Jewish tradition, it's used in different ways. It's often used by Jews and non-Jews to refer to the mitzvot of the Mosaic covenant and really all of Jewish teaching, right? Often Torah is translated as law in English, rendered as law in English. That's controversial. I mean, technically, that's not the root meaning of the word. The root meaning is something like teaching, instruction, guidance. Some even render it way. There's some debates here about the etymology of the term, the exact root of the term or roots of the term, but we don't have to get into all to the debates over the etymology of it. The root here is teaching, instruction, guidance, maybe even way. By the way, Taoism comes from this Chinese word Tao, which can mean a lot of different things, including way. The New Testament also teaches us that one of the first terms that was used for the Christians were their teachings was the way. But sometimes Jewish scholars will render the term Torah as way, but teaching, instruction, guidance, maybe way. What's a translation that's controversial? Law, right? I might talk about this in a future video, at least as of recording this video on September 2nd, 2024. I don't necessarily have an issue with translating Torah as law, at least in some contexts, but I understand why it's controversial. So anyhow, say that, we'll move on. Probably hear me tapping on my keyboard. Question number 3. Jews commonly divide the books of the Old Testament into 3 main sections, while Christians commonly divide them into 4. What are these divisions? Okay, this doesn't mean that Jews have always and only done it this way, or Christians have always and only done it this way. We actually know neither of those things is true. But for at least a long time now, Jews have divided the books of what we call the Old Testament. Again, they don't call it the Old Testament. We'll talk about that more in a minute. For a long time now, they divided them into 3 main parts. The Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. We've talked about what the word Torah means and the books it includes. Ketuvim, this is the prophets. Ketuvim, this means writings. So Jews for a long time have divided up these books into three main parts: the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the prophets, and the writings. You could take an acronym of those three and you get the word Tanakh, which is a word that's also used by Jews to denote what non-Jews often call the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible. Say a little more about that in a bit. But that's it. Jews typically divide these books into three parts: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Christians typically divide them into four parts. They've done this for a long time now. The Torah, so Jews and Christians begin the same way. Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But Christians typically, then the second section for them is typically the history, and then the wisdom books, and then the prophets. And a few comments on all this, right? One thing is that if you're a Christian and you know your Old Testament pretty well, and you go over to the Jewish Bible, you might be surprised by some things. You might say, wait a second, why is Daniel not in the Jewish prophets? Why is he in the Jewish writings? Yeah, there's some differences there, right? So when we talk about the second section for Jews, the prophets, it does line up pretty closely with the section called prophets in the Old Testament as Christians understand it. Not exactly the same. There are some interesting little differences there, and there's reasons for all of it. In the interest of time, I want to move on. One thing I do want to mention, I think it is pretty important. It often doesn't receive a whole lot of attention. It does sometimes. It should receive more attention than it does. The last book of the Old Testament. So it's not just that Jews and Christians, it's not just that Jews and Christians divide these books up into different numbers of sections. It's not even just that, Jews will sometimes place a book in writings that Christians will place in prophets, that they're using different numbers of categories, and the way they slot books into those categories isn't always intuitive for members of the other faith. It's and a whole other issue is that the way that the Old Testaments end for these two religions. If you look at the Christian Old Testament, the last book is Malachi. And maybe we'll read the end of Malachi. This is in the ESV translation. There's a bunch of good translations of the Bible today. None are perfect, but there's a bunch that are good. This is the end of Malachi chapter 4, the end of the Old Testament, and for Christians. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to the fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. What it really does, what Malachi really does, is it ends with this prophecy, looking forward to restoration. This might remind us of the book of Jeremiah now, looking forward to this restoration in the future. And there's different traditions in the Old Testament. You could look, for example, at the book of Ezekiel, chapter 39, verse 29, or the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse 28, or the book of Sirach, chapter 48, verse 10, other parts of the Old Testament where there's this idea that before this day of the Lord happens, where the day of the Lord gets interpreted in different ways, but it's basically this day in the future when maybe some bad stuff is going to happen, but there's also going to be this great restoration and things put to rights, that before that happens, there's going to be a prophet. God's going to send a prophet before all that happens, right? And what we have Malachi doing is signaling out Elijah. I don't want to get too into the weeds with this, my friends. It's really interesting, though. Elijah is a great prophet in the Old Testament. You see him at the end of the book of 1 Kings through the beginning of the book of Second Kings. He's in the books of Kings. Great prophet, interesting prophet. He doesn't die. He doesn't die, right? Before he dies, he's taken up in a fiery chariot to heaven. So he's one person who said explicitly in the Old Testament never dies. Many Jews and Christians have also thought that the early chapters of Genesis say something similar about Enoch. And by the way, for a Muslim, there's some debates in Islam about whether Idris is Enoch. Anyhow, we don't, just a little bit of, detail, I think kind of interesting along the way. But what Malachi is doing is it's looking forward to this big day, the day of the Lord that's going to happen when, God's going to visit his people and he's going to put things to rights. Things are kind of a mess. So when God comes to put things to rights, there could be some resistance from that, wars, other kinds of things. So it could also be a tough time. But the idea is God's going to send the prophet Elijah, who never died. He's going to come back to earth before all this happens. And again, Malachi is the end of the prophets, right? And the prophets are the end of the Old Testament for Christians. So this is like, if you're reading through the Bible, like page 1 to the end, like Genesis 1 to the end of Revelation as a Christian, the last part of the Old Testament you read is this prophecy from Malachi about this day of the Lord, and God will send Elijah back first. And then you turn over, right? You turn over to Matthew and, right? And actually, I'll even do it with Mark. You can do this with Matthew too, but Matthew starts with a genealogy. But I'll turn to Mark, the second book of the New Testament, second gospel, and this is what you read. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, actually a couple other books too. Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. John, that's John the Baptist, appeared baptizing in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And it goes on to talk about John the Baptist. So what you see in the New Testament, in the Gospels, is John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus, also a prophet in Islam, by the way. John the Baptist, prophet for Christians, prophet for Muslims, not for Jews. John the Baptist, cousin of Jesus, is a prophet that God sends before Jesus to kind of prepare the way for Jesus. And there's some traditions in the New Testament that want to link him up with Elijah, though maybe also some that are that maybe take a different view of it. It gets kind of complicated. But at any rate, the point is this. The way that the Christians organize the books of the Old Testament, it sets things up very nicely for Jesus. It sets things up very nicely for Jesus. I'll say it once more. The way that Christians organize the books of the Old Testament, it sets things up very nicely for Jesus. Now, if you look instead at the way that the Jews organized the books of what non-Jews often call the Old Testament, you just call it the Jewish Bible, maybe. It doesn't end with Malachi. It ends with the books of Chronicles. And what happens at the very end of the books of Chronicles? Well, let's read that. 2 Chronicles 36. You might recall we talked about this a bit in the earlier video. The Mosaic covenant. God makes this covenant with Israel. They're going to agree to keep all of his mitzvot, his commandments. If they agree to keep them and keep them, they'll be blessed, which means they hold on to their land and other things. If they agree to keep them and they don't keep them, they'll lose their land and other bad things will happen to them. But eventually they'll be brought back to their land. Even if they mess up and screw up, God's still going to bless them anyways and kind of figure out a way to get them on track. Now, at the very end of the book of Chronicles, what has happened, Second Chronicles, what has happened is the Jews have lost their land because of their disobedience. Might remind us of Adam and Eve, right? When are things going to start working out here, right? Okay. So anyhow, Christians will say, with Jesus, but, Jews are going to have different answers to that. So, what happens here is, towards the end of Second Chronicles, you see the Jews lose their land for disobedience. They lose it in stages. They lose all their land. They eventually lose the last bits of it at the hands of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, like in the 590s and 580s BCE, right? Where the Neo-Babylonians invade Jerusalem and tear down the walls of Jerusalem and tear down the temple and put an end to the line of Davidic kings and slaughter a lot of people, and according to tradition, cart a lot of the elites off to exile in Babylonia. But then enter the Persians, right? Enter the Persians, and the Persians defeat the Neo-Babylonians, and according to the Old Testament, send the Jews back home, give them their land back, and even give them money to rebuild the temple. This is the beginning of the Second Temple period. Now, they don't get the line of Davidic kings back, and I'm not going to say much more about that, except in the Christian tradition, Jesus restores that line. For Jews, that line is still broken, right? The Messiah is the figure who comes in to restore that. But according to the Old Testament, when the Jews go back and they rebuild the temple, they don't get their kings back, right? They don't get their kings back, but they do get to rebuild the temple. They do get their land back. They do have a kind of autonomy. They have a kind of freedom. And the way that many Jews and non-Jews have read the end of Second Chronicles, it's like their exile is over. Like, maybe, yeah, things aren't fully back to the way they were. For example, they don't have those Davidic kings back yet. But, you know, they're back in their land. They're going to get a new temple, and their relationship with God is put to rights. So in other words, a natural way to read the end of the Old Testament is the way the Jews order the books. Again, they don't call it the Old Testament. We could call it for them the Jewish Bible. The way that they order the books, how do those books all end? They end on restoration and reconciliation. And I think we can say a reaffirmation of Judaism and Jewish institutions. The ordering of the books is really critical. The way that the books end for Christians sets up things very nicely for Jesus. The way that Jews read them, it sets things up very nicely for the continuation of Judaism. That doesn't mean, by the way, that Malachi and Chronicles are in tension with one another. They're not. But the way that these two different religions order the books, the way they tend to read them, it's really fascinating, my friends. You could take the exact same books and rearrange them and get different meanings out of them. Fascinating. So, one other thing I want to add, still here in question 3, is that even though all Christians, more or less, agree on the 27 books of the New Testament, they agree on the books and they agree on the order, Jews and Christians, not only do they disagree on the order, they don't agree on the books. They don't agree on the books. So if you pick up a Catholic Bible like this, and you read through it all, and then you pick up the Jewish Bible, and you pay attention to all the books, you're going to say, wait a second. Yeah, this one doesn't have the New Testament. That's just for Christians. But the Jewish Bible is missing a lot of books that the Catholic Bible has in its Old Testament. The Catholic Old Testament has quite a few books in it that the Jewish Bible doesn't have. And if you get a translation from we could just kind of say a Protestant background, again, it doesn't mean everybody who worked on this thing's a Protestant, believing Protestant, you will see that those Catholic books are included here, but they're put in special sections. So this is actually where we do need to say a little bit about Protestantism and Catholicism. And I won't really have much to say here about Orthodoxy. Not trying to intend any disrespect. I'm actually an Orthodox Christian as myself, but I'm just trying to impart some basic information here, and I'm trying to keep this video short as possible. So you may all be aware, 1517, Martin Luther lived in the Holy Roman Empire. We call it Germany, but it wasn't really modern Germany like we think of it back then. Martin Luther launched the Protestant Reformation, right? He had a lot of complaints with the Roman Catholic Church. He had a lot of criticisms of the Roman Catholic Church. His intention, it seems, was not to split the church, but to reform it. He wanted the Roman Catholics to acknowledged his criticisms and said about the work of reform. What were his criticisms? They were different, right? Some of the criticisms he made were moral criticisms. So Roman Catholic priests for a long time now have been celibate. They don't marry. In the earliest days of the church, they did marry, and in the Christian East, they still do marry. They don't have to get married. Not all of them get married, but you can marry, and most do in the East. In the Orthodox Church, most priests are married. But at any rate, for a long time now, the Catholics have said that their priests can't get married. They're obviously not supposed to be having sex, because you're only supposed to have sex if you're married to the person with whom you are married. But in Luther's time, 500 years ago, it was well known there were a lot of priests that were sleeping with their congregants or just people about town and fathering children out of wedlock. And there was a number of other issues where the priests just weren't following their own rules. Now, actually, the Catholic Church did take this pretty seriously and did institute some serious reforms around this and some of the other moral issues that that Luther had an issue with, and this is part of what's often called the Counter-Reformation, which is also a very important, event, if you want to think of it that way, process in early modern European history, right? So anyhow, Luther had some concerns with, some moral concerns with the church. He also had concerns with the selling of indulgences. He also had some theological concerns about faith and works and grace and how we're saved and all that. I'm not going to get into that here. But the thing is that's important for us is that early Protestants, they were reading their Bibles, and their Bibles were in Latin, and they recognized that, because Latin was used heavily by the medieval church, medieval Catholic Church, and, they knew that the Bible wasn't originally written in Latin. Again, the Old Testament's Hebrew and Aramaic, and New Testament is Greek with a little bit of Aramaic. And they knew it wasn't originally written in Latin. And so they wanted to go back and retranslate these books and learn Greek, and some learned Hebrew. I don't know how many of them learned Aramaic, but at any rate, a lot of early Protestants, they took really seriously, biblical languages. So they wanted to kind of get back to the sources, right? Back to the original, so to speak. So they start doing this, and I'm really making a long story short here. What at least a number of these Protestants start to suspect is they start to say, wait a second, some of the books that are in our Bible that we can now call, or in our Old Testament, we can now call this the Catholic Old Testament. They said some of these books, we can't find Hebrew copies. The Jews that we're encountering, they don't have Hebrew copies. It looks like these books were originally written in Greek. And they knew that Jews didn't really start speaking Greek pretty heavily until it was a couple hundred years before Jesus, right? Thanks to Alexander the Great. We'll come back to him. But they had this view, this understanding that by the time Jews really started speaking Greek, Old Testament prophecy was closed. So in other words, they didn't regard these books as divinely inspired like they viewed the rest of the Bible. And so they took these books out of the Old Testament. That doesn't mean they thought all these books were bad. I have to confirm this. I read this a long time ago, but I've never confirmed it, that Luther himself was really fond of the book of Sirach, also called Ben Sira, also called Ecclesiasticus. Actually, I think it's a fantastic book. I love the book of Sirach. Some of these, some of the early Protestants who made this decision, it's when they took these books out of the Old Testament, it's not like they're saying they're all bad. I mean, they didn't try to stick their own writings in the Bible. That doesn't mean they thought their own writings were bad. They just thought they didn't belong in the Bible. Some of the books we could have had some serious concerns with, not necessarily all of them. But at any rate, at least part of the argument for a lot of these folks is that they thought the books they were taking out were originally written in Greek and not Hebrew. Were they right about that? Yes and no. It depends on the book. Right? So some of these books, it seems actually a lot of scholars now think they were originally written in Hebrew. Others were maybe originally written in Greek. But there, believe it or not, there's a book of the Old Testament that some scholars argue was actually originally entirely written in Aramaic, the book of Ecclesiastes, not Ecclesiasticus, which is another name for Sirach, about Ben Sira. I don't know if that's really got a whole lot of weight behind it, and maybe they wouldn't care that much about it anyhow because Aramaic's not the same as Greek, and got parts of the Old Testament written in Aramaic. Anyhow, whatever. This helps explain why Protestants actually don't have as many books in their Old Testament as Catholics do. So if you look at this book, again, the Jewish Bible, which I'm just calling the Old Testament, if you look at this, this has all and only the books in it that Protestants have in their Old Testament. They're arranged somewhat differently, but they're all there. Protestants in the Protestant Old Testament kind of sort of equals the Jewish Bible. What we could call, we'll just call it the Jewish Bible, kind of sort of equals it. It's the same books. Again, they're arranged differently, and that can really matter quite a lot, but it's the same books. But if you look at a Catholic Bible, the Old Testament's got even more books in it. It's got even more books in it. What are the names of some of them? We'll get to it in a minute. Now, Orthodox Christians like me, we've got all the stuff the Catholics got, and we've even got a little bit extra stuff that the Catholics don't have. And some groups of Orthodox have books that only that group has. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Whew, that was a lot. But, one takeaway from this is that we talk about the Old Testament all the time. There really is no such thing as the Old Testament. There are various Old Testaments. We might talk about the Jewish Old Testament, Jewish Bible, Protestant Old Testament, again, same books as a Jewish Bible, but organized differently, which actually does matter. Then we've also got Catholic Old Testament and various Orthodox Old Testaments. And we can even complicate it more than that. Just in the religion of Judaism and Christianity, which I'll do a little bit, but let's move on to question number 4. Why do many scholars object to the name Old Testament? Why do some object to the name Hebrew Bible? I want to be kind of quick about this because this video is already about half an hour. I want to wrap up as soon as I can. Again, I've been using this term Old Testament. Jews don't call it the Old Testament. Right? For them, it's current, so it's not old. They say, it's old in the sense it's ancient and it's venerable, but it's authoritative. It's not old in the sense of superannuated. It's not old in the sense of obsolete. Jews tend not to like to call it old. Also, they don't have a New Testament to contrast it with. That's the Christian New Testament that talks about Jesus, but Jesus doesn't have any authority, doesn't have any status in Judaism. He's not a prophet in Judaism, right? So Judaism as we typically understand it today, right? So, obviously the earliest Christians were all Jews, so there have been Jewish Christians, or even some Jews today that recognize Jesus as, Messiah and even God, but let's not get into the weeds on that. If we're just using the term Judaism to refer to Judaism as it's understood, different divisions, denominations, by the majority of Jews today, Jesus is not a prophet. He's not the Messiah. He's definitely not God. Beyond that, there's really not much of an official view on Jesus and Judaism. Okay. But for Christians, it's Old Testament new. The new is got these Gospels that talk about Jesus, letters of Paul, other things that all talk about Jesus, all proclaiming Jesus to be prophet, Messiah, maybe even God. That's not there in Judaism. So it's another so there's at least 2 reasons why it doesn't really make sense, you might say, to talk about the Old Testament, at least for Jews, as being old. It's not obsolete, it's current, and there's no New Testament to contrast it with. So a lot of Jews, they don't like the term Old Testament. A lot of Jews, they even find it insulting. They take it to be charged with this assumption that Christianity has surpassed Judaism and that Judaism is obsolete, maybe even worse, maybe like retrograde or something. And of course, the whole history of anti-Semitism plays in here. As many Jews really, really don't like the term Old Testament. And they definitely don't call their own Bible, typically they don't call it. Actually, sometimes they do. I'll get to that in a second. They don't typically call it the Old Testament. They just call it they just call it the Bible, or they don't typically call it the Jewish Bible. They just call it the Bible. If they're talking with non-Jews, they might call it the Jewish Bible. But they just typically call it the Bible or the Tanakh, or there's some other terms and from Jewish tradition for it, right? we still have a lot of scholars that call it Old Testament, and sometimes even Jewish scholars do. Again, they're not going to do that at the synagogue, but in scholarly writings, they'll still often use it, right? What should we make of this? So I want to say I have some sympathy with these reasons for not using the term Old Testament and wanting a more neutral term. I mean, again, even if we've got different versions of the Old Testament, in some way, maybe there is no such thing as the Old Testament, the one and only Old Testament. But then again, these different versions of it aren't totally separate either. The Old Testament's kind of one and many at the same time. It's kind of complicated. But yeah, I mean, I agree in general. I think it's good to have neutral terms for things that, don't bias us one way or the other, and that allow like Jews and Christians and others to talk about all this in an amicable way, without any concerns that, just the very language is prejudging things against somebody. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. Then again, I got to be honest, I still typically just use the term Old Testament. And I do it for a few reasons, and so do a lot of scholars. And one reason is we don't have a whole lot of good alternatives, I think. So you could just call it the Bible, but that if we call the Old Testament the Bible, that rules out the New Testament, rules out that hugely important part of the Christian Bible. It basically just ignores Christianity. So that's not great. You might just call it the Jewish Bible, but then again, that ignores that it serves as scripture for the Christians as their Old Testament. A lot of scholars say, let's just call it the Hebrew Bible, but it's not all in Hebrew. Now, a lot of scholars will say, like one of them, John Barton, I'll come back to this, by the way, John Barton, in this book, A History of the Bible, and other writings, he says, well, yeah, of course, the Old Testament is not all in Hebrew, but it's mostly in Hebrew, so calling it Hebrew Bible is not that far off. Yeah, he's right about the fact that there's not a whole lot of Aramaic in the Old Testament, though I think it is significant, but it goes well beyond that. This is where I'm going to bring in my orthodoxy. As an Orthodox Christian, to me, to call it the Hebrew Bible, it totally just ignores all of Eastern Christianity. For most of us, the Old Testament lives in Greek, and we would want to point out, they would want to say, what languages were the New Testament written in again? Greek and just a little bit of Aramaic. Yeah, that's right. The New Testament is mostly written in Greek. It quotes and alludes to the Old Testament all the time, and it does it in Greek. And we know that the Old Testament authors were often relying on a translation of the Old Testament done into Greek before Jesus was born, because we've got a lot of Jews reading Greek, writing Greek, speaking Greek a little bit before Jesus, thanks to Alexander the Great. This translation is called the Septuagint. That is a main source for the Old Testament that the New Testament authors used. Just calling it Hebrew, I think there's some deep problems with that. And the Catholics, I don't know. I need to do some research on this. I read a lot of Catholic theology and a lot of Catholic history and Catholic spirituality. I spend a lot of time attending Catholic church, but I got to be honest, I haven't read too much about the Vulgate and the other Latin editions of Latin translations of the Bible that have been used in the Catholic Church, and the rulings on them made at the various councils and how that's all thought about today. But I wonder if a lot of educated Catholics would also, they'd say, wait a second, you left out the Latin. And again, Jews and Protestants might say, yeah, but the original is what really counts. But that's exactly what Orthodox are going to challenge. We're going to say the New Testament authors didn't use the original, they used the Greek. And Catholics might want to make a similar, or not exactly similar, but they may want to make it maybe a different kind of argument. I don't know, maybe it would be similar. Maybe there's a couple arguments they want to make about, something even about divine inspiration of the Latin. So I think once we start calling it just the Hebrew scripture, I think Barton's a great scholar, but sadly I think he really kind of missed this. This is something that sticks out a lot to Orthodox Christians, but maybe not a lot of other folks. I think to just call it, and the Hebrew is we call it the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation that, again, the New Testament authors used. I've said this in class all the time. The Hebrew Bible, Old Testament Jewish, whatever you want to call it. These are about the most influential books in the history of the human race, and I don't know if we really got a good name for them in English or really any other language. One other thing I want to add here before moving on is that I also don't think the word old has to mean obsolete. Maybe that's the way the term's often been used, at least in the past by Christians, but it doesn't have to be. Old could mean a lot of different things. It could have negative valences. It could have positive valences. It can have both at the same time. I think we can use the term Old Testament without it having any negative valence whatsoever. And it doesn't matter if that's how people used to use the term. Sometimes people think of words in this kind of magical way. Like if the first person who used the word cookie, no one actually thinks like this. I'm using this example to show, I think, kind of how wrong this way of thinking is. If the first person who used the word cookie was thinking of chocolate chip, that doesn't mean only chocolate chip is cookie, right? It could be oatmeal raisin, right? Just because somebody used a word for a while with a certain intention behind it doesn't mean the word is stuck with that forever. Now, sometimes words really do carry a lot of baggage, though, too, obviously. So I want to be really careful about that. But at least in a lot of the scholarly community, I don't think Old Testament really. Maybe I'm naive about that, but it doesn't seem to me to carry negative connotations. This does get a little bit complicated with the New Testament itself, too, I want to add, because how does the New Testament actually view the Old Testament? Well, those passages from Hebrews I cited earlier, at least one of them actually does refer in the ESV translation to the Old Covenant being obsolete. Then again, the exact way that Hebrews understands that Old Covenant is kind of complicated, and there's other parts of the New Testament that I think push against that. Now, we could even ask whether the New Testament has a perfectly consistent, coherent view of the Old Testament and how easy it is to work it out. I will just register here that actually there are some Christians who would just come out and say, actually, the Old Testament is obsolete and the Bible itself says so. New Testament says so. There's a lot of other Christians, even pretty traditional ones, who would say, yeah, let's slow down here. This is kind of complicated. At any rate, there's just so much that could be said here. I hope one thing that you're taking away from all this, by the way, is not just some basic facts, but how complicated the notion of a basic fact in religion even is, and how much theory and debate there is behind a lot. And by the way, you might say, well, geez, that gives me a headache. I just want to stick with something simple like physics. Yeah, good luck, because physics is complicated too. Economics, this is just how real scholarship works, my friends. We're not being picky. We're just dealing with the complexity kind of in a sort of minimal way. If it's a bit overwhelming, don't feel bad. It kind of is at first. You can watch the video again, or I don't know, go play some Luigi's Mansion 3 and come back to it and give it another go. All right. So I've wrapped up number 4. Why do many scholars object to the name Old Testament? Let me just do a quick summary, for students who have to answer this for my midterm for Old Testament class. Why do they object to it? You could just stick with one reason, because a lot of them say that when we use the word Old Testament, it implies that those texts are obsolete, and that's either insulting or at least it's biased, and that we should have a non-biased term for these books. What is the alternative that scholars most like? Hebrew Bible. Is there also a problem with that? Yeah, it ain't all in Hebrew, right? What's another problem with it? Everything else I said about it. But I'll use the term Hebrew Bible a lot as well, because it's also commonly used, and it is what it is. Again, I'm not happy with Barton saying it's not too far off. For Orthodox, it's all the way off, but what are you going to do? We just have to learn to live with some things. I did not get upset about that at all. If other people want to get upset about it, they're totally free to do it. Free country. All right. Question number 5. Give the titles of 7 books that are found in Catholic and Orthodox versions of the Old Testament, but are not found in the Protestant Old Testament or the Jewish Bible. Why did early Protestants argue these books should be removed from the Bible? What do scholars today make of these arguments? Finally, are any of the deuterocanonical or apocryphal books of the Old Testament referenced positively by authors of the New Testament? Okay. Yeah. Some of this I already answered. The middle part, why did the early Protestants argue these books should be removed? Already covered it. They thought they were originally written in Greek, not in Hebrew. and that meant they were written after the time Old Testament prophecy had closed. What do modern scholars make of those arguments? Again, I think they're right about some of the books, wrong about others. It's typically what critical scholars think about that. What are the titles of 7 of these books? I'll give you 7. It's not the only ones, but here are 7. Tobit, T-O-B-I-T, Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the Book of Wisdom, the Book of Sirach, also called Ecclesiasticus, also called Ben Sira, and finally the Book of Baruch. Those are 7. Let me close off here. Are any of the deuterocanonical apocryphal books of the Old Testament? The term apocryphal can mean different things in different contexts, different things in the context of the New Testament, different things in the context of the Old. What it typically means in the context of the Old, and when it's used this way, it's pretty much means deuterocanonical. These are the books that the Catholics had and that the Protestants took out. Are any of those books actually cited, referenced, alluded to positively in the New Testament? They are. That raises a really interesting question too, and you get debates about that. This kind of sometimes comes up in debates between Catholics and Protestants, or Orthodox and Protestants. If you take out these books of the Old Testament, but the New Testament is referencing them positively, should you be doing that? Then again, this will lead into question 6. Protestants maybe come back and say, and again, I'm not Protestant, I'm Orthodox, but I'm trying to just be model neutrality here and see things from all positions, look at things from all sides. Protestants might say, yeah, but the New Testament also references books positively that none of us put in our Bibles, old or new. And then maybe a non-Christian from outside says, shouldn't you all be worried about that? All right, I'll come back to that in a second. Question number 6. Give the titles of 2 books that are found only in the Old Testament of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So again, different Orthodox, all these Orthodox have all the Old Testament books that the Catholics have, but some different Orthodox groups have books in their Old Testament that even other Orthodox don't have. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a very old Christian church. Christianity is in Africa very early. Ethiopian church is very old. 2 books they have that only they have and no other Christian group has, no other Orthodox group has in their Old Testament are the Book of Jubilees and the Book of 1st Enoch. Now, we're running at almost 50 minutes. I need to end this here. So I'm just going to say really quickly, you can actually find the Book of 1st Enoch referenced in the Christian New Testament. So look at the Book of Jude. I think it's verse 14, if memory serves me correct. Most scholars would agree there's a reference there to the Book of 1st Enoch, but that's not in any Christian's Bible, Old Testament or New Testament. But the author of Jude seems to reference it positively. What do we do with all that? Boy, that is complicated. But we are out of time. So catch you on the future video. Hope you found this all useful.